A Jewish father hears screaming outside his door. A mob is gathering, and they're killing every Jew they find. He has seconds to decide. Hide his family, flee, fight. 150 died that night. But here's what's remarkable. Judaism didn't die with them. For 1,000 years, through massacres, expulsions, plagues, and constant persecution, Jewish communities didn't just survive medieval Europe. They preserved their faith, their texts, and their identity. How? The answer reveals one of history's most extraordinary survival stories. First, what were they actually facing? Between roughly 500 and 1500 CE, Jewish communities across Europe lived under restrictions that seem unthinkable today. In most kingdoms, Jews couldn't own farmland, couldn't join craft guilds, couldn't hold public office, couldn't even testify against a Christian in court. No land, no guilds, no power, no voice. In Venice, starting in 1516, they were physically locked into a separate district every night. Gates closed at sunset. Armed guards patrolled. We still use that word today, ghetto. But, and this matters, these restrictions weren't identical everywhere. Some cities were harsher, some lords were more tolerant. That inconsistency, it became part of how they survived. The reality created a strange paradox. Christian doctrine said charging interest to fellow Christians was sinful. But medieval economies desperately needed credit. Kings needed war loans and merchants needed capital. Jewish communities filled that gap, not by choice, by elimination. The only door left open, they became essential to the same societies that marginalized them. Think about that. You're hated, but needed, resented, but protected until you're not. 1095. Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade. The mission: reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. Should have had nothing to do with European Jews, right? It had everything to do with them. As Crusader armies marched through the Rhineland, what's now Western Germany, a twisted logic took hold. One chronicle records a crusader asking, "Why should we march thousands of miles to fight enemies of Christ when enemies of Christ live right here among us?" Speyer. Worms, Mainz, Cologne. Entire communities, families who had lived there for generations, were massacred in weeks, and this pattern repeated. First Crusade, Second Crusade, Third Crusade. Every time armies gathered, Jewish communities held their breath, but nobody expected what happened next. Some communities received advance warning. How? Merchant networks, family connections spanning countries. When word spread that crusaders were approaching, families sent children to relatives in Italy. Scholars smuggled irreplaceable texts to safer cities. Valuables were hidden or transported. Their strategy wasn't fighting back, it was strategic scatter. Imagine living like that. Your survival plan is having family in other countries because you might need to flee at any moment. That's not paranoia when it keeps coming true. 1347 to 1353. The Black Death sweeps across Europe. Between 75 and 200 million people die. More than half of everyone alive. Gone. People were terrified, desperate for answers, desperate for someone to blame. And a rumor started spreading. Jews had poisoned the wells. Never mind the Jews were dying from the plague too. Never mind that the accusation made 0 sense. Fear doesn't need logic. Strasbourg, February 1349. The plague hadn't even reached the city yet, but the rumor had. Mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, 900 people burned alive in a single day. Not for anything they did, for a rumor. The death toll across Europe during the plague years is almost impossible to calculate. Hundreds of communities destroyed. And yet, the survivors did something remarkable. Jewish communities had always kept meticulous records. Births, deaths, marriages, property, debts owed. Lineage traced back generations. When survivors fled to Poland, to the Ottoman Empire, to anywhere safer, They brought those records. They could prove who they were, reclaim scattered family, document what was owed, rebuild with evidence instead of just memory. In a world where most people couldn't even write their own name, this was a superpower. This number still surprises me. Across medieval Christian Europe, literacy rates hovered around 5 to 10%. Kings sometimes couldn't read their own treaties. Jewish communities, 80 to 90% literacy among men, 5 to 10% versus 80 to 90. Every Jewish boy was expected to learn Hebrew, to read the Torah, to study sacred texts. This wasn't optional. It was a religious obligation. But there's a deeper strategy here. Think about what happens when you're expelled from a country. You can't take your house, you can't take your land, you can't take your shop or your inventory. Most of your possessions? Left behind. But what's in your head? Nobody can take that at the border. A physician expelled from Spain could practice medicine in Constantinople. A scholar forced out of France could teach in Italy. A merchant expelled from England could rebuild in Poland. Skills traveled, languages transferred. Expertise had value everywhere. Unlike gold, unlike property, unlike anything physical, knowledge couldn't be confiscated. This is where the strategy becomes almost modern. Because Jewish communities were scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, they developed something businesses today spend fortunes trying to build: international family networks. A merchant in Barcelona might have cousins in Cairo, business contacts in Venice, trading partners in Constantinople. These weren't just family reunions. This was survival infrastructure. Let me show you how this worked in practice. When Spain expelled roughly 200,000 Jews in 1492, where did they go? The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II didn't just tolerate them, he actively welcomed them. Why? Because he understood their value. He reportedly mocked the Spanish monarchs, calling them fools for impoverishing their own kingdom by throwing away such wealth. But the refugees didn't arrive helpless. They had contacts waiting in Constantinople, Alexandria, and Salonika. Networks are already in place. They brought skills in medicine, printing, textile production, and international trade. Ask yourself honestly, how many of us could relocate to another continent and rebuild our careers using nothing but family connections and transferable skills? That's the level of resilience we're talking about, built across generations of necessity. So after 1,000 years of this, massacres, expulsions, plagues blamed on them, laws designed against them, what kept them standing? Not armies. They had none. Not political power. They were systematically excluded. Not luck. Luck runs out. It was something simpler and harder. Education, knowledge that couldn't be confiscated at any border. Community, networks that caught families when they fell. Records, documentation that preserved identity across generations. Adaptability, skills that translate anywhere. They bet everything on what couldn't be taken, and they were right. By 1500, Judaism hadn't just survived. The Ashkenazi tradition in Eastern Europe, the Sephardic tradition across the Mediterranean, both carried forward ancient heritage while adapting to dozens of different circumstances. 1,000 years, still here. The strategies developed during those 1,000 difficult years, education, community, adaptability, documentation, those aren't just historical curiosities. They're a blueprint for how any marginalized community survives when the world is designed against them. I'm genuinely curious. Which survival strategy surprised you most? The literacy advantage? The network effect? Something else? Tell me in the comments. I read them. If this changed how you see medieval history, subscribe. We go deep on stories like this every week. Next video, medieval castle sieges. Why did some fortresses hold for years while others fell in days? The engineering will shock you. See you there.